let me know if anything like pops up for you.
I just said recording started.
Okay.
That's it. So
great.
Hi.
Hi.
Meghan Tschanz, is that how you pronounce your name?
Yep, you got it perfectly right. Yep, that's right.
Awesome. I'm EDJ.
And I'm Joy Williams, and I love the spelling of your last name. I'm so curious about it. So
it's I can tell you, it's the German-speaking part of Switzerland. So that's where it's from.
Are you German, or your husband, or how did you acquire that?
Actually, my grandfather comes from a lineage of Swiss immigrants. So that's how I got it. I didn't change I did change my name when I got married to Faith Tschanz. I hyphenated it, but I kept my last name like publicly because I had already been known a little bit for that. And also just a way kind of to retain my original identity. So my actually didn't change my last name or hyphenate it until last year, right before I had my daughter. Because we're like, well, what last name do we give our daughter? And then we all just hyphenated it. So
great. Okay. All right. Thank you for the story.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So we were wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your deconstruction journey.
Yeah, well, I grew up in the conservative evangelical church and was raised with the belief that women couldn't lead or teach or really do anything, and that their primary purpose was to get married and to have children. I always struggled with that idea, especially because when I was in elementary school, I was being told that girls can do anything boys can do. But then I was having this church experience tell me something differently. And I've always been competitive and loud and outspoken and all of these traits that were typically associated with like masculine traits. And so I struggled from a very young age to kind of fit into these paradigms or to agree with these teachings. But I thought, hey, if God wants me to be silent and submissive and do all of these things because I love God, I'll do it. But I was just praying that there was another way. So I went to college. I studied journalism and graduated right as newspapers were dying in the United States, probably all over the world, but specifically in the United States. And so I was like, wow, I wasted my college education. And so I, loved God. So I was like, I'll be a missionary. And it was actually my mission work that led me into the space of deconstruction, because I got to see that the oppression that I experienced as a woman in my faith experience was, number one, not unique and actually quite mild compared to the way women were treated around the world. And so as I was having these encounters, I noticed that the more abusive or the more oppressive a space was, the more they adhered to these patriarchal gender norms, which were espoused and celebrated in my faith tradition. And I was starting to question, okay, if this is God's order, if this is God's way, if this is the way that families should function, why is there so much harm? Why is there so much abuse? Why is there, I saw girls have to fight for an education. I saw them survivors of female genital mutilation. I saw women being sex trafficked and girls being sex trafficked. And it was always in these very patriarchal contexts. And the views about the women were also very patriarchal. And so I started pushing back against it and asking my church, I'm like, hey, I think patriarchy is bad. And they just told me, Megan, this is not patriarchy. This is people doing patriarchy wrong. The system isn't flawed. People are doing it wrong. And I tried to believe that. Well, I didn't really. I tried to push against it until it came so clear to me. I was working with women who were exploited in the Philippines, and we were helping them go through college. And I was talking to a man there who was purchasing these exploited women, and he asked us why we were there, and we're like, told him like a lot of these women don't have a choice. They don't have an education, and this is all they can do to survive and provide for their families. And, we asked him the question back, and he said, I come to get the respect that I deserve. That this man was a former military from the United States who said women in the States don't know their place. And here I get the respect that I deserve, and women should be submissive. And he just went on a very long rant about it. And I was like, this is so familiar. Where have I heard it before? And it just hit me like a ton of bricks that I had heard it my whole upbringing, and it was stamped as holy. But in this moment, it became so clear to me that this is not God. It doesn't matter what stamp you put on it. Like these motivations are evil. There's no other word for it. And so I quit my job. And I knew that I had to advocate for women. So I started a podcast called Faith and Feminism, and I tried to write a book, but I felt like I couldn't, I had spent so many years working with these women. And if I truly cared about them, I couldn't be a participant in a system that harmed them. And I just couldn't be part of it anymore. And so, I quit. And then I quickly found out just how much the church or the church I came from did not like feminism, which I knew, but it got pretty nasty. So that's in a nutshell my story of deconstruction and how I ended up doing the work that I'm doing now. So
yeah, wow, I think that's awesome.
Yeah,
that's a lot. That we can just unpack that in of itself. Like, what countries were you in? And you don't have to answer these questions, but there's a ton of things. I'm just curious if you can just give the listeners a little bit about, when did you start? You said that you started it as a way to advocate for these women. So how long has that podcast been going on, and what kind of receptivity have you gotten from that denomination, and perhaps the women that you are advocating for? Have they listened to it? And tell us a little bit about that, if you don't mind.
So this is all in 2016. So coinciding with all of these awakenings in the United States, you have an election which white evangelicals voted for a president that bragged about sexual assault. So I can't claim that this was also not part of it. I think it was all feeding into this environment is not a safe place for women, and they say they care about women, but they clearly don't. And so this was all happening around the same time. And I remember the day that Donald Trump was elected, I worked in marketing for this missions organization. And I was sobbing because as a survivor of sexual assault, as someone who has worked with countless survivors, I just was like, how could you do this? And how could you say this is godly? And I remember a mentor, or someone that I considered a mentor, who actually knew about how I was sexually assaulted on the field. He told me that this was God's way, and that I would one day understand it. And I think that was also another indication this is not a safe place. And I started to really push. That also led me to speak up more in the organization. I got some sexist policy changes, or policies changed, but as a result, I was also kind of ostracized, and I fell from the golden child status to she's a problem. And so all of these things were ushering me out the door. And like I said, when I quit, I didn't even know where to begin. I just knew that I had to do something. I had to make the church safer for women. And so eventually I came to realized that I actually had a lot to learn. And I knew that through a podcast, I could get access to experts and racial justice folks and all of these people I wouldn't necessarily have access to otherwise. And so that was kind of the idea, is I need to learn. I don't know where to start, but I also know that I'm not the only one asking these questions. And so I started the podcast, and to give you an idea of its reception, the very first day I released it, all I had was 3 1-star reviews. So I have theories about who left those reviews. I don't know, obviously. But I can tell you that immediately there was incredible pushback. I got emails from family members telling me I wasn't Christian, that I couldn't be Christian and feminist. And I realized again and again, please just listen to my story, listen to my experience, and you would see how I got here. I'm not just trying to burn the church down. I honestly think that, we're doing it wrong. And this is for me, it was the only way I knew to be faithful to my faith. and to these women. It was the only way forward. And so, yeah, I mean, that eventually led me to writing the book. It's because I was like, maybe if they can like hear my whole story, they can understand where I'm coming from, and maybe I can change their mind. But I can't tell you in a conversation, first of all, because you're talking over me the entire time. But secondly, like if I can just capture your space and walk you through the process that I went through, maybe you can see how I got here, and maybe your mind can change too. And so that's kind of what drove me to write the book. But I'll tell you that like I had friends disassociate with me, that they told me that they couldn't be tied to the liberal agenda, because apparently fighting for women's rights is, you know, an agenda, which is, I mean, it is, but they're acting like patriarchy isn't an agenda as well. So like, yes, of course it's an agenda, but so is theirs. But, and so anyways, I lost friends. I went through like a great, I don't know, probably year of just kind of being heartbroken over that. And because it wasn't just my friends, it was my family. I was being gossiped about in the community. I knew all of these things, but I knew I had to be like faithful to God's call. And it came really clear to me. Actually, I can only explain it as a divine experience, but it was my 30th birthday, and it was during the Kavanaugh hearings, which are you familiar with the Kavanaugh hearings here in the United States? Kavanaugh is a Supreme Court justice. So someone that's very influential, accused, very credibly accused of sexual assault, of attempted rape on someone. And so the woman came forward and shared her story when he was, you know, when the hearings were going forward to see if we should confirm this guy on the Supreme Court. And Christians attacked her. They said, you know, that she was just making it up. Listening to her testimony, it was so clear to me that she was telling the truth. And besides the fact that 96% of women who come forward are telling the truth, like besides that, what she said, she was just a very credible witness. And the Christian church as a whole was more interested in protecting power and getting Kavanaugh on the bench because he was a conservative justice than they were about women. Again, so choosing Trump over women, choosing Kavanaugh over women. And so it was during this time, and I was outspoken in my belief in Dr. Ford, who was the woman who shared her story. And I had more people come against me, specifically Christians. And it was during that time it was my 30th birthday. I was really doubting if, like, maybe they're right. Maybe God is against me. Maybe, you know, maybe God hates women. I don't know. Like I was just really, like, I had so many of my loved ones telling me I was wrong. I thought maybe they're right. Maybe I am wrong. Maybe God loves patriarchy. And I remember, like, it was my birthday. I got a really, you know, I thought it would be a really sweet message from a friend on my birthday. And I opened the message, and it was just a very long, explanation of how I was being deceived and how God was against me and how God, you know, was going to punish Dr. Ford for speaking up. And I just thought I couldn't take it anymore. I started crying. It was my birthday, and this was in the midst of my family, also some members of my family also disowning me. And I remember just crying, getting in my car, crying so hard I couldn't even drive home. And I had this woman knock on my window while I was crying. And I got out of my car, and I couldn't talk because I was crying so hard. But she just embraced me, and she said, "I'm not going to let you leave until you know how loved you are. And God is with you." And obviously, this woman had no idea who I was. She didn't know I was crying. She didn't know anything. And honestly, I couldn't speak because I was crying so hard, and I was just crying more and more. And just sobbing all over this woman's chest in a Starbucks parking lot. And I think that was like God's way of showing that I was on the right path. And as I've continued forward, I know this is like God's work. Like, God is not a misogynist. Like, I know this is what God has called me to. And so to answer your question, I mean, that's I've been doing the podcast for 4 or 5 years. And I published my book. I took a while to publish my book, but I published that 2 years ago. And And now I'm actually in grad school getting my Master of Divinity, because I feel so clearly that this is what I'm meant to do, is to make the world safer for women. And so many, it's not just Christianity, so many faiths incorporate patriarchy into their religion and say that this is God's way, and it's causing so much harm and so much oppression. We can see this happening, with the story of Masa and Iran, and how, she lost her life, and then there's all of these protests. But that was, again, a marriage of patriarchy and religion and the state. And so for me, I want the patriarchy gone in all religions, but I'm going to start with my own. So anyways, that's kind of how long I've been doing this work, and why I believe it's important is, so.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That's incredible. Yeah. And I do remember that you wrote about the Kavanaugh trial in your book as well. Mm-hmm. You've been very honest in your podcast and your book about sexual assault and all, and many other things. But I too believe that I experienced sexual assault, though I don't exactly remember it. But I had some counseling, and I confessed to it, to like a vague sort of memory. That was it definitely impacted my entire life. Like I felt bound by purity culture, bound to abstain, and very unable to bring myself to actually have sex with anyone ever. Abstinence only to the extreme. And so that was something that I had to kind of overcome in order to get married, because marriage and sex is basically the same thing in my mind. And that took a lot of years. But I'm wondering now, like, how do we help our children and the next generation navigate their sexuality in light of, we don't want them to be totally trapped by purity culture, but also there's damage that can be done by engaging in sex too soon, or by sexual abuse. Do you have any ideas about how do we move forward?
I get this question a lot, which is funny because I'm totally not a sex expert. I can point you to other experts and I can tell you what I've learned from them, but I want to refrain. I am not a sex expert. But there are really good. So I'm just going to mention them first, and then I'm going to answer your question. There's a Christian sex educator. Her name is Dr. Tina Shermer Sellers. She has very good stuff, and a lot of the stuff I've learned from her. There's other resources if you're looking. So EDJ, what you mentioned is really common, actually, for people who've grown up in purity culture. There's actually a physiological response that many women experience from purity culture, where sex is painful, they have vaginismus, they're not actually able. And so there's a pelvic health therapist. Her name is, oh my goodness. I know too many names. Her name is Sarah Moses, I think. She was one of I don't remember her name exactly, but I think it's Sarah Moses. But she's a pelvic health specialist. And then maybe, like, if there's show notes, I can come back with her actual name. I think it's that. But she talks about how she saw clients for a long time that it's actually the way that purity culture shows up in women's bodies is actually a lot like survivors of sexual assault. So we need to talk about that. We need to talk about this is actually an abusive system, because we can see the way it's affecting women's bodies. To mention nothing of purity culture is rape culture. And I'm going to give I know that's a big statement, but it's true. I have a lot of anecdotal evidence in my own life, but there's actually another researcher. Her name is Dr. Laura Anderson. And she just actually, the book's right here, but she just came out with a book called When Religion Hurts. It's not specifically about purity culture, but as someone who has a PhD and studies this and is a therapist, she says purity culture is actually, it creates trauma. So all of that to say is purity cultures is not great. That's not how we want to raise our children. And the idea that, women are responsible for men's thoughts or men's actions, it is rape culture. There's just no other word for that, because men are in charge of their own and their own desires and bodily functions and stuff like that. And it also, we need to acknowledge that these systems, so the system of patriarchy within the church, what they call complementarianism or, biblical gender roles, is actually creating a system of hierarchy. Obviously, because women are supposed to submit to men and like follow them and they're their spiritual leader and stuff. But there's tons of studies on this that power differentials is actually the reason that sexual assault happens. Sexual assault is not about sex or a desire for sex. It's a need for dominance and control. There's another researcher that I reference her a lot, and I'm going to look it up because she's done a lot of work here, and I want people to look her up. Her name is Lynn Yonak. She studies this. So there's a bunch of research.
Can you spell that last name just for people who might want to Google it?
Yeah. Yonak. So her first name is Lynn, Lyn. Her last name is Yonak, Yonack.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. And I also all of these women are actually mentioned. If you want to get my book, I have all of this research in my book, but I reference them. Oh, it's not Sarah Moses. It's Amy Moses. I knew.
Yay, came back.
Yeah, I came back. But yeah, so Amy Moses is the pelvic health specialist. But anyways, all of these teachings are actually quite harmful. We see the physiological response, we see the response on our brains, and we also know it perpetuates rape culture. So we know purity culture is the way we don't want to go. I think in terms of teaching healthy sexual ethic, that's a lot harder, right? Okay, we know not what to do. And that's kind of one of the things purity culture is like, I don't want people to have, sex before marriage. But what that did is throw everything in service to abstinence culture. And so throughout health, mental health and physical health and all of those other things. And it also just said any sex that happens within marriage is good sex, which we know is not true. There's tons of abusive sex happening within marriage. So all of that to say, there's another great person who talks about this. You probably know of her, Sheila Gregoire. Yes. She also talks about this. But so for me, I think, where do we go from here? It's a trickier question. And I think it's one that there isn't any pat answers. I can tell you that there is some research being done in other countries. For example, in the Netherlands, they start teaching sex education as young as 5. And that's not like sex education as we think about it, where you go like see slides of, at least in the United States, they show you like slides of herpes and stuff. That's basically what I got. It's like, don't have sex or you'll get STIs. That was my entire sexual education. But in the Netherlands, they start sex education, which starts very young, and it's just from kindergarten, teaching the concept of consent. And I have a daughter, and we are actually, there's a book club called Little Feminist Book Clubs, and we have a baby book that is teaching about consent. It's called Will Ladybug Hug? So there's like a ladybug that loves like hugging everyone, and the ladybug is learning to ask if they can hug someone. And so that's just like a really simple way that can start very young, where we're teaching consent, that your body is your body, that you have a choice of whether or not you want to hug, and we need to respect other people's choices if they want to hug. So that is sex education, because consent is a major reason, because we're not taught about this, that there is so much sexual assault happening. So that's a very simple answer. We can start teaching babies, toddlers, about ask if you can have a hug. Do you want to hug? Okay, you don't want to hug. You don't have to hug. That's okay. So that's a simple.
And then if I can just interject, so I work with nursery kids a lot, and I also want to affirm when babies or toddlers don't want to get a hug from an adult, and it's like it's okay, like yes, it's the child or whatever age asking for that intimacy, but then also being okay to say no. You don't want this adult to hug you or kiss you.
Right.
And so I try to affirm babies or children, like whenever I can, when I see that.
Yeah, me too. Like sometimes people want to get in my daughter's space, and you can see from her body language, she can't talk yet. She's 1 year old, but that she doesn't want to be touched. And I'll be like, hey, you know, until she has the words to say, like, don't touch her. I don't think she likes that. Like I'll say things like that because she doesn't have to like that. Even though it's an adult that thinks she's cute and like wants to like tickle her or whatever, it doesn't seem like she's enjoying that. So maybe don't do that. So we can start very young. And I think that's part of the problem is I think we often conflate ideas that like sex is its own category, but it's not. There's so many other intersections of our sexuality that do start really young. And we're not, obviously, you're not teaching kids in nursery school about like penetration or anything like that. They don't need to know that. That's way too young. And that's probably a form of sexual abuse. But we can teach about subjects like consent. And so I think what we need to identify is, number one, teaching people about like respect, consent. That can start really young. I think it's also really important, you know, for kids to know, you know, when they're entering the teen years, about, first of all, it's normal to have a lot of bodily desires, to feel. I remember the first time I felt like aroused, and I was scared by it because I didn't know what was happening. But to have these conversations, these are normal bodily functions. This is normal part of your development. It does not need to be shamed. But let's talk about, how do we properly like care for ourselves and care for others? And there's, like I said, there's resources that Dr. Tina Schirmer-Seller has, and she gave me one of her books, which I don't know where it is, but she actually has this specifically how to talk to your preteens about shameless parenting. Yeah. How to talk to your preteens. And so I think that's another great resource. But for me, the main thing I want to teach my daughter and any future children, if I choose to have them, which I honestly don't know if I want more children, but I want to teach them how to honor and love their bodies. And how to know how to say no, or I like this, or I don't like this, or whatever. And then also know that other people should honor and revere their bodies. And if they are not in a relationship where someone is treating them with the utmost reverence and respect, that is not a safe person to engage sexually with. And so that's when I want to just really hammer down this concept that you are made in the image of God. You are worthy of respect. Your boundaries are worthy of respect. And I think if I can get that foundation down, that's going to remove a lot of harmful things that could happen to her. If I'm not ready, if she's not ready, then she can say, I'm not ready, you know, and in a way that's not shame-based. And so that's what I've basically learned, to sum up from a lot of the Christian sex educators out there, or the ones I follow at least, is to realize that your body is very special and deserving of honor and reverence, and to communicate that with others. And if a person is not showing respect or honor or reverence to your body, that person is not safe to engage anyway. And you know, probably in a lot of ways sexually, but just on a base level, probably not a good friend either, or a good whoever. So I think if we can instill that, because even I remember like my first boyfriend, I did not like kissing him. He did, but I did not like it, and I really liked him. I just was not ready for that kind of, and it was just kissing. It wasn't even anything else. I didn't feel ready for it, and I didn't have the language to say, you know what, I really like you as a person, and I do want to be in a relationship with you, but this is like, I'm not ready for this. I didn't have words to communicate that, and I felt like the only thing I could do was break up with this person. And I think that caused like a lot of harm on both ways, especially the way I handled it. But it was just because I didn't know myself. I didn't know how to speak up for myself. I didn't know, like, hey, I don't really feel comfortable with this. And if I can teach my children how to honor themselves and to honor one another, then I think that's going to really help in terms of healthy sexuality. It's not a black and white rule. I think it's more of like a concept that I want to teach. So I don't know if that answers your question.
I think you did. Yeah, Tina Schirmer-Seller's, her resources are great. And the other ones you mentioned, So you also mentioned that some women experience pain in the vagina when they have sex, or for me, it was actually when I inserted a tampon for the first time, I nearly passed out from the pain, which is like, that's really weird, right? Like I was going, what in the heck? It's a tiny little thing. I was 22. I'd never even touched down there. And I kind of realized that after the fact, realized that I had experienced vaginismus, and I was really glad that I was able to overcome that before getting married and engaging in sex. So I just wanted to mention that for other listeners, because I do believe that's a result of purity culture trauma and 100%. Sexual abuse trauma. Right. Both mixed together can really cause serious problems. So if you experience anything like that, it's great if you can read Tina Schermerseller's or some of these other people to overcome those kinds of things.
And we could probably do a whole other podcast just on purity culture, and then maybe even invite some of the sex experts and Christian experts. I would really love that, because I think first is being able to define what is purity culture. Like what has people internalized as that being its own thing. And I think that as we talk to folks, to different people, there is like a common overview of like what we're talking about, like no sex before marriage. And it mainly applies to women, and it mainly applies to women who are heterosexual, heterosexual. And it's so much more, and it doesn't talk about all the complications that you even alluded to, Meghan. I invite you back already to have that conversation, because as EDJ shared some of her experience with purity culture, myself, I am still a virgin, and I still hold to not having sex before marriage. Like I'm also 43, and I've held this for so long that it's like, I don't even know what it would do to me if I like tried, like, like talking about mental health and like how deep, ingrained the psychology of that is about like how we feel about ourselves. How does God look at us? And faith has been such a strong and important part of my whole entire life from what I can even remember as a child. From just being in church culture to actually adopting Jesus as my Lord and Savior, to actually saying, okay, I am choosing to live in a particular way according to how I understand what people tell me what I should do to be a follower of Christ. So like, that's so deep.
It's so deep.
But some of the elements that you brought out about same gender loving people, and I too have traveled to different places, and it was eye-opening when I went to the continent of Africa, and I went to at least 2 different countries. And when we were talking about homosexuality, it was like, no, we can't use that word. It's men that have sex with other men. And when because being in a heterosexual relationship, marriage with several wives, is such a part of the culture, that homosexuality and the same concept that we internalize it and understand it here in the US did not exist when I traveled back then. I don't know if things have changed. It's been a while since I've been there and worked in public health in those communities. So I'm not sure how things have changed, if they have changed at all. But the concept of how we understand sex, sexuality. I started these conversations around the same time that you started your podcast called Faith, Sex, and Sexuality, where we talked about stories. We didn't talk about theology. If people wanted to bring it up from their own personal story, that was talked about. But in terms of framing the conversations that we had, it was more so around the individuals leading what they wanted to share, and then people feeling free to ask questions about it. And so that was some of the most powerful experiences that I had, because I had in the room face to face a trans woman and a Black conservative Baptist pastor talking to each other for the first time. And the Black pastor acknowledging that he was raped by a man when he was younger, and identified very clearly as a heterosexual, whereas it gets complicated and we can unpack all of that. But I just appreciated what you had to say and then what you added, EDJ. So thank you for having some time to talk about that. But I feel like we need to have it our own podcast, just talking about that topic to really define purity culture. And that's where I was going with it. What are the elements about it that create this abusive? And you named one already about just it being so focused on women and women having to be responsible for men's actions. But purity culture leaves out so many other experiences that also creates a ton of harm because there's so many explorations. So while I say that I'm a virgin when it comes to penetrative sex with a man, I am by no means pure when we really talk about purity culture. And I do have experiences with having sexual relationships with girls when I was younger, with females. So if we look at sex, no, I am not, quote, a virgin. But when we look at the way that purity culture has defined sex and the ways in which it restricts us from even exploring our sexuality in a healthy way, then I would say, let's have that conversation. Let's unpack all of that.
I mean, it's a lot to unpack. And it's, and like you, I think something I want to point out about what you mentioned, I think there's so much fear for women to even begin asking these questions because we've been told since for our whole lives that our worth is in our purity. And so to even start to ask questions, to even admit things that have happened to us or that we've done, it really messes with our sense of value and worth. And I want to acknowledge that. And I think that's why it's so harmful. It's like, there's all of these teachings, specifically these object lessons. If you do anything sexual, you're a spitting cup or you're a licked lollipop. Or for me, what I was taught is that you're a balled flower, and you're not going to have any value to anyone. Your only value is to basically be consumed by one man. And if that happens before, then you're not of any value. And so I think that's why it's so important and also so harmful is that women are told their whole worth and identity and value is in this concept of purity. Which is something that in a lot of cases isn't in our control. A lot of us have had unwanted sexual experiences that we had no choice over. And I know that for that, the first time my breast was touched was sexual assault from a stranger on the street. But I didn't tell anyone about that for 10 years because I thought I just became a licked lollipop or a spitting cup or a balled flower or whatever it is. And there was so much shame around that. And so I think it's so important to have these conversations because our whole worth isn't in our sexuality. It isn't in our quote unquote purity. We're so much more than that. And that's just an aspect of it. And I hate the undue emphasis that evangelical culture has put on sex. And then you get married and you start having sex and you're like, it was all about this. All of this was about this. Wow. I'm not a different person because I had sex, but that's what I believed before I had sex. It's every time someone had sex, I'm like, oh my gosh, you're a completely different person. But no, I'm still me. I just had an experience.
When I got married and had sex, I'm walking down the street going, do people know?
I know.
I just had sex for the first time. And I'm like, no, this is not earth-shattering. It's not life-changing. It wasn't as big as we're taught it is.
Yeah. There's a book that I read. I had him on the podcast called Non-Toxic Masculinity. And I don't agree with everything this guy said, but one thing I really did resonate with is the church's obsession with sex. And if you read all of these, and one of the things me and a friend of mine do is we go through these evangelical women's books and dismantle them and we deconstruct them and we see all of the harmful messages that we're getting about sex. But again, just the whole book, basically these whole books are about how to pleasure your husband and how to be pretty for him and how to make him feel good. And so this whole even system of purity culture has been set up not for our own benefit, not to help us, but for the benefit of men and how they want us to be. And so I just want to emphasize that having these conversations is really hard and it's really scary. And I remember the first time I had conversations like this on my podcast, I would giggle because I had trauma. And there was no other way to put it. I had sexual trauma, and that was like one of the responses. And I got some negative feedback that I shouldn't giggle. And then, you know, I talked about it with my therapist. I'm like, oh, actually, this is a sexual trauma response. And I think a lot of us have sexual trauma, even if we've never done anything, because we grew up in purity culture. And so I really think it's been really harmful how much undue emphasis there has been on sex, as if that's our only reason for existing, is whether or not we're pure or not. And it's a very patriarchal concept. And so I don't know. So I guess I want to offer empathy for anyone's feeling like uncomfortable by this conversation, or feel like, you know, I'm thinking about this thing I did or this thing I didn't do, and there's also, I feel like, shame even for people who haven't had sex. I remember feeling that, like, when, you know, when I waited till marriage, and I also felt a sense of shame that I had, but I also would have felt shame if I hadn't. And so I'm just in this double bind where like, I'm just conditioned to feel shame no matter what I do because I'm a woman. And so I think that's another aspect of it, and we just need to dismantle it. So.
And I want to also put in the perspective for any males that are that might be listening, and I say males, referring mainly to the body part of a penis, and not necessarily the identity of how someone may identify. But here's a story that purity culture, even though we're talking about the impacts of it having on female bodies, and specifically anyone who carries a vagina, there is also and this blew my mind because I had never heard a story like this before until one of my friends from college got married, also a Christian. Her husband was a Christian. They waited until they got married to have their first kiss. And he decided not to have sex until he was married. She did not. And she was telling me that they had so much difficulty at the beginning of their marriage because he was mad at her for not saving herself for him. And whereas he had saved himself for her. That's loaded. I know it's because they didn't like know each other until like they decided to date. But the point of me bringing this up is that there are many different intricacies of like what the purity code, even though that we're focusing on like how it has impacted us individually. And I think we all here identify as female. It runs a lot deeper than that. And just the complications within marriage. Because I have usually heard the side of men marrying a woman, and she saying how he was upset that she didn't save himself, that she did not, even though that he was not a virgin, he was like not okay. He wanted to find a virgin, basically. But to hear the perspective of a man being a virgin and then having all of that place, it was like, I don't even know how to understand this. Like, what? Like, where is the anger? Like, how are you all, like, it was just so much about the element of control and like destiny and like how are you supposed to like complete it was a lot. It was a lot for me to understand from her perspective. So I also just want to add for any listeners that may be affected but may not identify in the same way that the three of us may identify, and maybe we haven't touched on their story yet, but just to know the stories keep going.
One other thing I want to point out is in this system of patriarchy, as I emphasized before, Len Yonak, the researcher I mentioned before, she talks about sexual assault is about power. So because we're in this patriarchal construct, there's actually quite a abuse against little boys too, because it's all about the system of power, who has authority and whatever, and who does not. And so I think we also need to acknowledge like this abuse, this assault does not only happen to little girls, it also happens to little boys, but it is all feeding out of the system of patriarchy that requires dominance and authority of one figure and someone being submissive to that. And so that's what I really want people to understand about like sexual assault. It is all about power and control and dominance. And so that's not to say, I mean, most often the victims are female, that you'll see that across the board, but that's because of the system of patriarchy, but they're not the only victims. Patriarchy also harms men, which we could go into a really long way about how it also harms men. But so all of that to say, it's the system that teaches men that their masculinity is found in dominating and controlling others. And so,
And just to add another nuance, and also there are women who have adopted that same power exertion. I heard the story of a male, and this is recent, like within the last couple of years, and he told me that his first sexual experience was from his babysitter, who was a female, and she had raped him. And it continued, and that was how he learned how to have sex, and then how to treat, or just to continue having sex. So it happens, and the players can change identities and faces. But what you said, Meghan, it's about the power. And if we can begin to understand what that is about, then I think a lot of these control of your body, religion, and control over your actions, control over how you're supposed to worship God, I think we'll see a little bit more clearly about how to start to have a different experience within all of these systems that really have power at the top.
One more thing I want to, that story that you just mentioned, I will say it is quite a bit more rare for women to be the perpetrators. That's just data. Y'all, I think, are from a different country. Anyways.
Oh, no, I'm actually here from the US. EDJ is from Australia.
I can tell by her accent, so I don't want to speak for that. In the United States, you can see across the board, the main perpetrators of violence are men, especially sexual violence. That does not to say that it doesn't happen on the other side, but I want to emphasize that even the way that this is framed, like the masculinity script, oftentimes when young boys are sexually abused or assaulted or raped by older women, it's almost like, yeah, way to go, you got your sexual lesson so early. So even the way that it's framed is he is still powerful, and you'll see that where a lot of young boys won't realize that they have been sexually assaulted or raped, because the idea is that a man's role is to get notches in his belt or whatever. And so even that idea is hard for people to realize, oh, actually that was rape. That was whatever, because the way that it's framed is way to go, and it's not that way. And so again, another system of patriarchy where the script has to do with male conquest of women. And so even if they've been the ones that have been abused, it might be hard to recognize that as such.
That's such a good point. Because there is he used the word rape, but there is another story that I met with, he is actually a family member, and the way that he retold being raped by his babysitter, who was a female, it could have been because he was I don't know, but the way that he told it, I was like, do you understand the psychological impact of what you're telling me right now? So I had two separate experiences of one being this is what happened to my babysitter. And that kind of really spun me into this whole other, and whereas another male was telling me, who was much older and a family member, of his experiences, but it was almost like what you were saying, Meghan, this notch,
Wow.
So it's been very impactful as I started having these conversations around faith, sex, and sexuality, and learning how complicated the intersection of those three are, and the many different stories of the players. That's what I call it. The different players can switch out, but so I appreciate you sharing so much and adding so many nuances, and the stories that I added on to, by no means did I want to undermine the big story of men being mainly the patriarchy system and having that power given to men, and then how that's affected more for women. So I don't want to undermine that story. I just wanted to flavor with other listeners that we may not touch on your story, but we know that there are nuances to this dynamic.
Yeah. There's one more thing I want to say in the Christian space.
Please. Yeah.
I think it's so funny when people are like, I'm talking about biblical sex, like how to have biblical sex. And as someone who is in seminary right now and going very deep into the Bible, biblical sex is weird, it's messed up, it's harmful.
Yeah.
These stories that we have, like, so here, I'll give you the example of Tamar and Judah. So there's, in the Bible, there's a story of a father-in-law, Judah, has a daughter-in-law, her husband dies. She doesn't have kids. Her whole, purpose is like, you need to have children. And so he kind of just like abandons her and like forgets her and doesn't do what he's supposed to do, which is provide like another son to like get her pregnant, which is the whole system is just really messed up. We'll just acknowledge that. But what she does is she poses as a prostitute, or a sex worker. They used the word prostitute back then. And, seduces her father-in-law, becomes pregnant by him, but in order to, she's like, for payment, she requested his like staff or his signet or whatever. And so he finds out that his daughter-in-law is pregnant and he orders her to death. Again, we're going to talk about patriarchy and how messed up that is. And then she shows him his signet and be like, you're the father. And then she is called righteous. Okay. So I just want to, like, there are so many dynamics in here in this patriarchal culture, but I think it's so interesting that we've been taught that biblical or righteous sex is in marriage, and here she is being called righteous for seducing her father-in-law to, I guess, I mean, in her way, it was the only way she could receive justice and to get what she deserved. And so I just really want to even just like really push back against there's this idea of a biblical or right way to have sex, because if we look throughout scripture, sex is messed up. In fact, I can't even, maybe the Song of Solomon or maybe the Song of Songs is the only one I can think of that maybe shows like some healthy sexuality. And that apparently is about people who are unmarried. So take that for what you will. But I really just even want to deconstruct this concept that the Bible is giving us a framework of how sex should be. I think it gives us a lot of, don't do sex like this. This is harmful. Examples. There's the story of like two daughters raping their dad when he's drunk. Like there's just really messed up stories. And so I really just even want to push back against this idea that it's very clear how sex should happen. Because if we look at scripture, there's actually probably very few that I'm aware of besides, I think the Song of Songs is, okay, in terms of like, maybe this is like a healthy form of sex. But again, it said most biblical scholars agree that they weren't married. So I just even want to push back against this idea that we've always been taught that there's a biblical way to have sex. Or that we need to wait for marriage. That's not in the Bible. And so I just want people to like have the courage to kind of do some deep dives into what biblical sex looks like. And I think a lot of the examples of biblical sex we're given are like, actually, this was harmful and this is why. So we can see like, with David and Bathsheba, like that was harmful sex. We can, even in this patriarchal retelling of the story, we can see how harmful this situation was. And so that's just one more thing I want to say is like people who claim that they have an idea of like how biblical sex works. Have you read the Bible? Because it's weird. And there's a lot of weird examples. And so I think I just want to give people like, don't believe people who say that have all the answers. That what my professor says, going through the Hebrew Bible, is the Bible is far more a book of questions than it is answers. And
experience.
And going through that, I can say that with absolute clarity. I'm just getting more and more questions. I think I'm gaining maybe a clearer picture on who I view God to be, but it's not straight and simple. And the Bible wasn't made to be read in a way that's literal or straight and simple. Anyways, I just wanted to add that little tidbit because people who claim that they know how sex should function in the Christian world, I don't think there's anyone that can honestly claim that after reading the Bible. It's not clear. So
I would definitely sanction that. It's not, there's so many elements of how we live our life that are just not clear in the Bible. And I would even there to say that purity culture, the way that I understand it from a biblical, includes so much of our actions in day to day that people would consider non-sexual. And that's the other thing about purity culture too, is that we don't talk about the other elements of like how God wants us to be pure, if that's going to be a thing in the church. And then what happens when we don't have sex? What do we do then? What do we do with urges? So Meghan, I again want to invite you to come back on to have that specific conversation around purity culture. I think we can really go. Would you be interested in tackling?
Yeah, I would love to come back.
Okay.
I'm in grad school right now. I emailed EDJ this morning and I was like, I don't have time for 2 hours because of grad school, but I can come back after November 17th. I have like a full month and a half off of grad school. But I will also come back with a lot more insight because I'll have just, completed my first quarter, which honestly, I'm learning so much. I love it. I love
Congratulations.
It. Yeah.
I hated my divinity degree.
Oh, really? I chose a very progressive school.
So did I.
I would read this stuff I would read it on my own without a degree because it is so fascinating. I could just gobble it up. So,
Well, the literature, my experience in and of itself was very, like, I grew so much. I think it was the dissonance of the ideas, but we can talk about that when we meet back up again. But congratulations on going to grad school and dive in deeper. And thank you for giving us so much of your time. We are at the hour mark, so we're gonna let you go. But thank you again.
If you want to plug your stuff.
Oh yeah. So I wrote a book, which I think is if you're wondering, like, here it is. If you're wondering how, I mentioned so many different resources pertaining to sex. I mentioned Amy Moses. I source her, Dr. Tina Schirmer-Sellers. I also mentioned Dr. Verena Brown, which let me just throw this real small tidbit. Virginity is not a physical construct. She is she's a child abuse pediatrician. So her job is actually to do like forensic analysis when someone, might have been sexually assaulted, and the way that the women's body is built, specifically the hymen, is a stretchy organ. It's like a scrunchie. You cannot tell by looking at a hymen someone who's had sex versus someone who's had a baby.
Yeah, so, I was shocked when I read that in your book.
It shocked me too when I learned that.
I'm 40 years old and I've only just learned this.
Right. I know. So, I mean, this is again the way that